Not surprisingly, this temple service was very much the private affair of the king and his chosen few. The lesser priests could proceed only as far as the inner hall, while laity, unless they were serving temporarily as lay priests or temple servitors, could go only as far as the open court. The common people, especially, were generally kept at arm's length from the temple's more sacred activities. Nevertheless, they could still participate in the cultus after their own fashion, especially in the New Kingdom, when the increasing democratization of religion allowed the laity a closer relationship to the deity and a larger role in its worship. Anyone could watch from the banks of the river as the god's portable ark sailed by on its way to visit a remote shrine or the temple of a kindred deity. And when the ark was carried through the town on a litter, the common people might join the procession themselves, or use the occasion to seek the god's advice, or to request his judgment in a dispute. They could bring an offering to the temple to be presented by the priests on their behalf. They could prostrate themselves at one of the god's shrines and pour out a libation of water before his statue, or they might invoke the favor one of his deified human servants, such as Imhotep or Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, who might be induced to intercede with the god on their behalf. They could consult special shrines for oracular advice or healing, and on festival days they might even throng the open forecourt, join with the temple chorus in singing hymns to the god, and share in the distribution of loaves from the god's table. If they were fortunate enough to make the pilgrimage to the sacred site of Abydos and visit the tomb of Osiris, they could watch the passion play of that god's death and resurrection as it was reenacted over several days by live actors, perhaps participating along the way in rites of mourning, sacred brawls, and a drunken orgy that would make today's spring break festivities look tame by comparison. There were also shrines in private homes, some dedicated to one of the high gods, others to minor apotropaic deities such as Bez or Tauret, and some even to deified humans such as Amenhotep I, the patron of the New Kingdom workmen's community at Deir el-Medina. In short, there were a myriad of ways for the common people of Egypt to participate in its religion, even if they were not priests and could not enter the inner precincts of the great temples. Amenhotep III, First Re, 861-349 BC. At this point, we must return to our historical survey, for it was in the days of Amenhotep III and his son Amenhotep IV that politics and religion came together for the first time in a manner wholly unprecedented in the history of Egypt. As we have seen, Amenhotep III reigned in the midst of a cosmopolitan, international culture at a time of unparalleled Egyptian prosperity. This prosperity was especially fruitful for the great metropolis of Thebes, which, as the ancestral home of the ruling dynasty and the seat of that dynasty's patron deity, Amun, had now become Egypt's foremost city. But far from helping to cement the power of the royal house, Thebes' very success now presented a threat to that house's survival. For despite Amenhotep I's immense personal wealth and unquestioned secular power, the mystical authority of the kingship itself had already been severely battered by the disorders of the First and Second Intermediate periods. Now it was increasingly being undermined by the growing economic and political power of the Theban priesthood. As early as the Middle Kingdom, the priests of Amun had amalgamated their deity with the ancient sun god under the compound name of Amun-Ra. By this stratagem, they had sought with considerable success to portray Amun not merely as one god among many, but rather as the creator of the entire universe and the father of gods and men. As such, he was considered the master not only of Egypt, but of all other lands and peoples as well. Moreover, this theological ascendancy of Amun over all other deities, both foreign and domestic, had been paralleled by a bureaucratic ascendancy of Amun's priesthood over all other priesthoods. The financial holdings of the temples throughout Egypt were immense, and the high priest of Amun held sway not only over the precincts of his own god at Thebes and the cult of that god throughout the country, but also over the cult properties and personnel of all the other gods of Egypt. From this power base, the priests of Amun had repeatedly meddled in the royal succession and other political questions. And after the episode with Hatshepsut, it may well have occurred to her successors that if the power of Amun's priesthood were not checked, it was only a matter of time before the priests would be in a position to seize power directly. But the attempted fusion of Amun with Ra had had an unintended side effect, for it served to refocus both royal and popular interest on the much older cult of the sun god per se, not merely as a manifestation of the parvenu deity Amun, but in its own right as the ancient orthodoxy of all Egypt. Thutmose III had dubbed Thebes the Heliopolis of Upper Egypt, 98, which made Amun city the southern counterpart of highly revered northern Heliopolis, the ancient seat of the worship. While this could be seen as yet another power grab by a Theban priesthood bent on making Thebes the equal of Heliopolis, it may just as easily be interpreted as an attempt by Thutmose III to reintroduce the ancient religion of Ra into the very heart of Amun's territory, the opening shot in what was to become a multi-generational pharaonic assault on the power of Amun's priesthood. Similar developments followed. In the reign of Thutmose III's successor, Amenhotep II, wall paintings in the tombs of the upper classes began depicting the deceased king enthroned as Ra himself, with Ra's consort, Hathor, at his side. The next king, Thutmose IV, explicitly claimed, in a memorial stela set up after his coronation, to have been chosen by the sun god while he lay sleeping at high noon in the shadow of the Sphinx. Then he found the majesty of this noble god speaking from his own mouth, as a father speaks to his son, and saying, "Look at me, my son Thutmose. I am your father Horemeket Kepri Ra Atum. I shall give to you the kingship. You shall wear its white crown and its red crown on the throne of Geb, the heir. The land in its length and its breadth will be yours, and everything that the eye of the Lord of all illuminates. Good provisions will be for you from within the two lands, and the great produce of every foreign country, and a lifetime of time great in years. My face belongs to you, my heart belongs to you, and you belong to me." As Thutmose IV reported on this same stela, he had subsequently purified Heliopolis and propitiated Re. In other words, he restored the properties and rights of the sun god at Heliopolis, which had presumably fallen into neglect during the reigns of his predecessors. He also took the unprecedented step of appointing as his overseer of the prophets of all the gods of the two lands, not the high priest of Amun, as tradition required, but rather the military officer who tutored the king's own daughter. This represented a major shift of economic and political power from the Amun priesthood to the royal household, and one may easily imagine the bitter resentment of the Theban religious establishment at this heavy-handed royal interference with their traditional prerogatives. During this same period, hymns, extracted from the temple ritual of the solar cult, began to appear in copies of the Book of the Dead, on commemorative stelae and statues, and in inscriptions at the doors of tombs. There was even a series of new solar compositions describing the sun's nighttime journey through the underworld, the Litany of Ra, the Spell of the 12 Caves, the Book of the Hidden Chamber, and so forth. In many of these compositions, the sun god was not only the supreme deity, but also the font from which all other deities spring, even to the point where Ra and his ancient rival Osiris were held to be two manifestations of the same godhead. Taken together, these developments indicate an increasingly solar-oriented piety, not only on the part of the royal household, but also on the part of the aristocracy, and perhaps even the common people. The ancient religion of the sun god, which had temporarily fallen on hard times with the rise of Amun, was beginning to recover its former glory. Amenhotep III seems to have embraced and encouraged this growing solarism as the solution to a number of problems, both political and religious. On the international scene, it provided a common theological background for diplomatic conversation with Egypt's neighbors, especially the Hittites, whose pantheon was also headed by a sun god and whose theory of kingship was remarkably similar to Egypt's. On the level of internal Egyptian politics, it gave the pharaoh and his courtiers some much-needed leverage against the Theban priesthood, and on the level of popular propaganda, it provided a time-honored theoretical framework within which to restore the sagging power and prestige of the kingship itself. It is no surprise, therefore, to discover Amenhotep III emphasizing his own divine paternity in a manner strikingly like that of Hatshepsut, with temple reliefs describing in graphic detail how his mother was impregnated by Amun-Ra. She awoke on account of the aroma of the god and cried out in front of his majesty. He went to her straightway and caused her to see him in the form of a god. She rejoiced at the sight of his beauty, and love of him coursed through her limbs. The palace was flooded with the god's aroma. All his fragrances were of punt. Mutamwia spoke before the majesty of this august god, Amun-Ra, lord of the thrones of the two lands. How great is your power! Your dew permeates all my limbs. Then, the majesty of this god did all that he desired with her. We have already seen that Amenhotep III was a devoted patron of architecture and the arts, but he seems also to have been an antiquarian and amateur theologian. Nowhere is this more evident than in the celebration of the HBSD or Jubilee Festival, marking the 30th year of his reign. This festival went back to pre-dynastic times and represented not merely a commemoration of the king's coronation 3 decades before, but its repetition. That is, just as the king had first become invested with divine powers by his initial coronation, so in the rites of the HBSD, those powers were revived and renewed. In the Old Kingdom, the HBSD was so important that King Djoser had immortalized his festival facilities in stone as an integral part of his mortuary structure, thereby allowing the renewal of his kingship to be carried on eternally in the other world. By the time of New Kingdom, however, the HBSD had become a perfunctory affair, duly announced when the time came and largely ignored by everyone but the state functionaries who had to carry it out. With Amenhotep III, all this changed. He began making preparations for his first HBSD years in advance, sending royal officials throughout the country to search temple archives and examine ancient monuments in order to determine the proper rituals for the celebration. He also constructed a massive Jubilee Palace and an even more enormous mortuary complex, which together dwarfed anything ever built in Egypt, before or since. The mortuary complex alone covered some 300,000 square feet. It was filled with statues of the gods, including hundreds of images of the solar lion goddess, Sekhmet, and hundreds more of Amenhotep III himself, portrayed as a divinity in his own right. Two of the latter statues, seated figures which flanked a main gate of the complex, stood 60 feet tall and weighed hundreds of tons apiece. These were known in classical times as the Colossi of Memnon, and are all that remain today of the mortuary temple. The rest was quarried away by Amenhotep III's successors. He also constructed a new temple of Maat at Thebes, just north of the huge temple complex of Amun. And throughout it all, the iconography was pervasively solar. So, also was the configuration of much of the new construction in other temples scattered around Egypt and Nubia, even when they were dedicated to non-solar deities. Finally, as preparations for the festival neared completion, Amenhotep III moved his official seat of government from the ancient political capital of Memphis to Thebes, thereby putting himself in a better position not only to supervise the final arrangements for the Jubilee, but also to keep a closer eye on the Theban priesthood. The festival was a great success. Huge quantities of food and drink were consumed, expensive gifts were distributed, honored guests came from all over Egypt and beyond, and subsequently boasted of their participation on the walls of their tombs, while at least one foreign king complained bitterly that he had not received an invitation. More important, however, was the change in Amenhotep III's status, which he himself attributed to the efficaciousness of the festival's ritual. It had long been a commonplace of Egyptian belief that a deceased king joined the ranks of the gods, and in the Old Kingdom it had been held, at least in theory, that he was a veritable god in this life as well. Amenhotep III returned to this long-dormant notion for the first time since the collapse of the Old Kingdom, and now sought to make it a present reality. In the festival, he had actually taken a place in the sacred bark and been towed by the members of his court, just as Ra was towed through the underworld each night by the other gods. With the festival now consummated, his court proceeded to inaugurate a new artistic style, in which the elderly king was portrayed as a vibrant young man in scenes saturated with solar iconography. But the clearest indication of Amenhotep III's view of his own status after the completion of the festival was the name which he applied to his palace, his royal boat, and one of his armies. Nebmetra is the dazzling Aten. Nebmetra was Amenhotep I's own Enswabit name, and therefore referred to himself, while the Aten, with which he now sought to identify himself, was none other than the disk of the sun. Amenhotep before and the Amarna revolution. The word Aten, Egyptian, goes all the way back to the Old Kingdom as a generic word for round object or disk, including, of course, the celestial disks of the moon and especially the sun 0.11. Initially, the Aten seems to have been conceived primarily as the vehicle in which the sun god crossed the sky, but by the Middle Kingdom it had begun to take on the characteristics of a deity in its own right. For example, the tale of Sinuhie describes the death of Pharaoh Amenemhat I in the following terms. The god ascended to his horizon, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Sehete Perbe, was taken up to heaven and united with the Aten. The body of the god was merged with him who begot him. By the time of Hatshepsut in the New Kingdom, the Aten was being accorded the role of the creator, who created all being, who shaped the earth, who completed its creation. A scarab from the reign of Thutmose IV described that pharaoh as trampling the desert countries, treading as far as Naharin and Daroi, in order to make the inhabitants of foreign lands like subjects to the rule of Aten forever. The solar hymn of Sudi and Hor, which dates from the time of Amenhotep III, addresses the Aten in even more grandiose language. Hail to you, O Aten of the day, maker of everything, who causes them to live, great falcon, many-colored of plumage, Khepri who rises of his own accord and brings himself into being, unbegotten, eldest Horus who dwells in the midst of Nut, Knumen Amun of mankind, who takes possession of the two lands from great to small, beneficent mother of gods and men, and so on for many more lines. Clearly by this point we are no longer talking about the god's vehicle, but about the god himself. And not merely a god, but the supreme god who embodies in his own person all the other gods of Egypt. After the completion of the HBSD festival in his 30th year on the throne, Amenhotep III had publicly proclaimed himself to be the living Aten. No longer was this pharaoh, at least in his own eyes, merely a descendant of the sun god, which, in theory, every pharaoh had been. Now, he was nothing less than the sun god himself, the creator of heaven and earth, incarnate in human flesh, residing in his great palace on the western shore of Thebes and worshipped daily in the largest temple the world had ever seen. A better symbol of divine power in human form can hardly be imagined, at least in the Egyptian context. It still remained to be seen, however, whether or not the king's ploy would be effective in curbing the ambitions of the Theban priesthood and restoring the mystic prestige of the kingship. That test awaited his successor. Amenhotep III had apparently expected to be succeeded by his eldest son, who would have entered the annals of history as Thutmose V. In the event, however, Thutmosis predeceased his father. Hence, when Amenhotep III died after almost 4 decades on the throne, he was followed by his second son, Amenhotep IV, who took the Enswabit name of Neferkheperura. Beautiful are the manifestations of Ra. The young king seems to have been deeply affected by the religious pretensions of his father, so deeply in fact that he took the deification of Amenhotep IV rather more seriously than perhaps the old pharaoh himself had. Consequently, shortly after assuming the throne, Amenhotep IV initiated a series of religious reforms, which were apparently predicated on the objective reality of his father's divinity. These reforms were to shake Egypt to its foundations and ultimately led to the downfall of the royal house and the end of the 18th dynasty. Amenhotep IV's religious revolution began innocently enough with the building of new temples to the Aten in Thebes, Memphis, Heliopolis, and elsewhere. There was nothing unusual about this. Each new pharaoh was expected to demonstrate his piety by building new temples, and often these were dedicated especially to those deities with which the king felt a personal affinity. Meanwhile, the tombs and stelae of Amenhotep IV's closest friends and advisors, which were decorated in the early years of his reign, continued to acknowledge gods other than the Aten, and objects manufactured for use by the royal family continued to invoke those gods' blessings. The names thus attested include Osiris, Anubis, Hathor, Thoth, Isis, and of course Amun. For those with eyes to see, however, there were already hints of the trouble to come. For one thing, the iconography of the new temples exhibited innovations which must have had troubling overtones to anyone familiar with the ancient traditions. Indeed, the very architecture of the temples proclaimed a break with existing orthodoxy, since they harked back to the open-air sun temples of the Old Kingdom, rather than the cloistered structures of the standard New Kingdom cult temple. But more problematic than the architecture per se of the new temples would have been what was portrayed on their walls. For example, Amenhotep IV's wife Nefertiti, who seems to have been related in some fashion to the same family as his mother Tia, was prominently depicted on temple walls not as the reserved and diminutive wife demanded by the rules of decorum, but rather as if she were a pharaoh herself, wearing a royal crown, driving a chariot, smiting cowering enemies with a mace, and making such offerings to the Aten as would normally be reserved to the king alone. Worse yet were the new pharaoh's public sermons, in which he attempted to instruct the populace about the true nature of the gods they had heretofore worshipped, and to lead them to adore instead the one who alone was worthy of such worship, the Aten. The bits of text which have survived from these sermons are fragmentary, but it is easy enough to fill in the blanks. The old gods, the pharaoh must have said, were assembled out of gold and precious stones, according to the instruction manuals of the ancients, which he had seen with his own eyes in the temple archives. But just as over time their temples had crumbled into dust, so also their bodies had come to an end one after another, only to be replaced by new ones fashioned by human hands. And even while they lived, they still lacked the power to come and go as they pleased, but had to be bathed and clothed and carried about by human beings. How different was the Aten, whose origins are shrouded in mystery, who gave birth to himself, whose body was fashioned by the god alone, and who travels wherever he wills without human assistance or consent. In short, there is no other god like the Aten, who alone is truly God. Here was an ideological declaration of war whose intention could not be mistaken. Pharaoh's generosity and patience might compel him to tolerate the ancient cults for a time, but the long-term trajectory of his design was clear. If anyone still had any doubts, there was the fact that the Aten's new temples were, by royal decree, to be supported by diverting substantial revenues from the existing temple establishments, something which could not have gone down well with those, like the priesthood of Amun, whose livelihoods depended on such revenue. Unless anyone take the new order with less seriousness than it deserved, there were none too subtle warnings that temple administrators who resisted such diversions were putting themselves at risk of royal retribution. For the early years of his reign, Amenhotep IV depicted the Aten in the traditional guise of Ra-Hero-Ukhti, the ancient sun god of Heliopolis, i.e. as a hawk or hawk-headed man, crowned with the sun disk and bearing divine regalia. Quite soon, however, this form was universally replaced with an abstract depiction of a solar disk festooned with a uraeus, its hands outstretched toward the creation below. Surrounding the disk on either side were royal cartouches, symbolizing the universal kingship of the Aten, which enclosed the dogmatic formulation, "The living Ra-Heru-Ukhti is he who rejoices in the horizon, in his name as Shu who is in, or from, the Aten." Not only was this a novel depiction of the deity, a novel name for the deity, and a novel way of inscribing the deity's name, it also hinted at a novel self-understanding on the part of the king himself. In his speeches to his courtiers and his hymns to his god, Amenhotep IV referred repeatedly to my father the Aten, and even claimed to be related to the Aten as the son who came from his body. It is therefore hard to avoid the conclusion that Amenhotep IV had truly come to believe the old royal propaganda. His earthly father, Amenhotep III, had indeed been taken up to heaven and merged with the world-creating Aten, and was now benignly pouring down his life-giving rays upon his only begotten son. The logical conclusion, which the pharaoh himself apparently drew, and which others were invited to draw as well, was that Amenhotep IV and his wife Nefertiti could be none other than Shu and Tefnut, the sun god's divine twins, who were now incarnate in human form. There were other innovations as well. Amenhotep IV, like his predecessors, exhibited a keen personal interest in art, and under his sponsorship there emerged a new, more realistic style of painting and sculpture, a style which he was said to have developed himself and to have personally taught to the royal craftsmen. Language, too, was revolutionized by the creation of a new royal dialect, far removed from the classical Egyptian of the Middle Kingdom, which to that point had been the standard language of literature and the court. This new tongue drew heavily on the current vernacular, without, however, reproducing it exactly. thereby creating a new official language, one that was as unique to Amenhotep as were the other aspects of his revolutionary movement. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV officially changed his name to Akhenaten, he who is useful to the Aten. While it was not entirely without precedent for a king of Egypt to change his name in mid-reign, it was certainly not the usual practice, and to most Egyptians, it must have come as both a shock and a harbinger of things to come. More radical yet were the pharaoh's plans for the capital. In the same year in which he promulgated his new name, he also announced his intention to move the royal residence from Thebes to a new city built on virgin land which had been chosen, in some unspecified fashion, by the Aten himself. The site lay halfway between Thebes and Memphis, and it was clearly meant to replace both of them as the religious and political center of a new order. Its name would be Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today, it is known to us by its modern name of Amarna, and the era inaugurated by Akhenaten is consequently called the Amarna period. It is impossible at this distance to know whether the pharaoh's primary motivation for building his new city was to establish the worship of the Aten on purer soil away from the pollution of polytheistic Thebes, or simply to escape the hostility which his reforms had inevitably spawned there. Perhaps it was both. Certainly, he felt hemmed in and oppressed in Amun's ancient city, as he himself revealed in the speech which officially inaugurated the site of his future capital. Therein he hinted darkly that the sedition which had reached his ears at Thebes had grown worse with each passing year of his reign, and in fact was worse than anything which had been heard by any kings who had ever assumed the white crown. Whatever this sedition may have been, it was to be richly repaid. Having already extirpated the name of Amun from his own titulary, and having determined to abandon Thebes and move the capital elsewhere, Akhenaten no longer had anything to lose by antagonizing the priesthood Amun and the citizenry of Thebes still further. Consequently, he was now well positioned to make a definitive break with the old Amunist orthodoxy and to wreak a savage revenge on its adherents. His plan was simple. The old gods, and especially Amun, were officially proscribed. Their worship was prohibited, their temples were closed, their revenues were appropriated by the crown, their personnel were either laid off or pressed into the service of the new order. The very name of Amun was anathematized, and an army of official vandals fanned out across Egypt to efface Amun's name wherever it could be found, even in the cartouches of the pharaoh's own father. The growing persecution of other gods even impacted the dogmatic name of the Aten, which was now changed to read, "The living Ra, ruler of the two horizons, is he who rejoices in the horizon in his name, as Ra the Father who comes as the Aten." This new titulary, by removing the earlier references to Shu and Horus, finally purged the last elements of polytheism from the official state religion, and unmistakably signaled a total break of the new religion with the old. Moreover, since only the divine twins, Akhenaten and Nefertiti, truly knew the Aten their father, and only they understood his decrees, it followed that only they could worship him directly. The rest of Egypt must be content to worship the Aten through his divine children as mediator and mediatrix. Hence, at Akhetaten, we find the daily procession of Akhenaten in his chariot, replacing the traditional processions of the gods on festival days, and household shrines to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, replacing the traditional domestic shrines to the household gods. Needless to say, such radical changes in polity and theology inevitably met with considerable opposition. But the army was commanded by faithful officers who had served under Akhenaten's father. One of these, an old master of horses from Akhmim by the name of Ai, was Akhenaten's maternal uncle and, it is often alleged, the Gray Eminence of the regime. Another was a high-ranking officer named Horemheb, who would later become the commander of the army under Tutankhamun, and even later a pharaoh in his own right. Under their leadership, the army remained steadfastly loyal to Akhenaten, despite whatever personal misgivings the individual soldiers may have felt at the king's odd behavior. Indeed, in the art of the Amarna period, the army seems omnipresent, and it may well be, contrary to the popular modern perception of Akhenaten as some sort of pacifist, that Egyptian society under Akhenaten was militarized to a greater extent than ever before. With the move to the new capital, new men, i.e., those with neither aristocratic connections nor previous government experience, entered the picture in alarming numbers. And in the land of Egypt, beyond Akhenaten's borders, things quickly went to ruin. The temples, with their immense landholdings and huge grain reserves, had been the powerhouses of the national economy, as well as the sustainers of both morality and morale. Now they were shuttered, their estates languishing, their functions in the social order unfulfilled. Inevitably, both the national economy and society as a whole suffered as a result. Further afield, matters were also going from bad to worse on the northern frontiers. Already in the last years of Amenhotep III, the Hittites had been gaining strength and putting increasing pressure on Egypt's possessions in Syria and her allies in Mitanni. Now desperate Egyptian vassals in the region were pleading, mostly in vain, for Pharaoh's assistance in suppressing not only external invasion, but local insurgencies as well. The Northern Empire, upon which Thutmose III had expended so much blood and treasure, and which had fueled the Egyptian Golden Age into which Akhenaten had been born, was coming apart at the seams. But Akhenaten, it appears, was largely indifferent to all of this. Isolated in Akhetaten, which he had vowed never to leave for as long as he lived, the pharaoh was busy presiding over the construction of his new city, palaces for himself and his retainers, government offices for the royal bureaucracy, tombs to receive the city's dead, and, most importantly, huge, open-air, Heliopolitan-style sun temples for the worship of the Aten. Akhenaten himself presided over the cult as its sole priest, taught the cult's doctrine as its sole prophet, wrote its hymns as its sole poet, and established its linguistic and artistic norms by his personal decree. The greatest of Akhenaten's hymns, the great hymn to the Aten, survives in a single copy in A's tomb. Ironically, the great hymn's luxuriant description of the Aten as the source of all life and truth draws heavily on the long tradition of solar hymnody dedicated to Amun-Ra. Although purged, of course, of that tradition's polytheistic tinges, it also amply displays both the poetic talents and the megalomania of the heretic pharaoh, who declared in the final lines of the hymn, "There does not exist another who knows you, apart from your son, Neferkheperora, the only one of Ra, whom you grant to be wise in your counsel and power. You raised up everything for your son who came from your body, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt who lives on Mut, the lord of the two lands, Neferkheperura, the only one of Ra, the son of Ra who lives on Mut, the lord of crowns, Akhenaten, great in his time, and the great king's wife his beloved, the lady of the two lands, Neferneferu and Nefertiti, may she live and be vigorous forever and ever." But neither Akhenaten nor Nefertiti were to live forever and ever. On the contrary, Akhenaten reigned for only 17 years, 2/3 of which were spent in the self-imposed internal exile of Akhetaten, and when he died, his revolution died with him. Akhenaten's immediate successor, Smenkhare, is a shadowy figure about whom almost nothing is known beyond his name. In fact, it is well within the realm of possibility that he was actually a Shi'ai, Akhenaten's queen Nefertiti, who may have been installed as co-regent in Akhenaten's later years and then succeeded to the throne after his death. In any case, Smenkhare's reign was brief and left almost no mark on Egyptian history that we can now discern. After Smenkhare came Tutankhaten, who was married to one of Akhenaten's daughters and may also have been Akhenaten's son by a secondary wife. He quickly abandoned both his father's new city and his Atenist exclusivism, restoring the capital to Memphis and the state religion to the worship of the old gods. The youthful Tutankhaten, acting, no doubt on the advice of Ayam-Horemheb, even went so far as to change his name to Tutankhamun, and issued a decree lamenting the state into which things had fallen under Akhenaten, and celebrating their restoration under his own rule. After Tutankhamun's untimely death at the age of 17, he was succeeded for a few years by the elderly Aya, who was the last of the old line. Then came Horemheb, who had served as a high-ranking military officer under the previous 4 pharaohs, but now usurped the throne and set about reversing everything they had sought to accomplish. The Aten temples were all pulled down. Somewhat later, Akhetaten itself was demolished and its stone reused elsewhere. Ultimately, the names of Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, and A were erased from all public monuments and official records. Horemheb's name was inserted immediately after that of Amenhotep III in the official king lists, and the intervening regnal years calculated as his own. Thus ended the 18th dynasty, and with it the most glorious era of Egyptian history. Not with a bang, but a whimper. Yet despite its ignominious end, the Amarna period had an enormous impact on subsequent Egyptian religion and culture. Its radical artistic style influenced even official art for generations to come, and its groundbreaking use of the vernacular opened the door to the literary flowering of late Egyptian. Indeed, it is one of the great ironies of history that Akhenaten's artistic and linguistic innovations not only survived him, but ultimately triumphed as the standard for subsequent generations, even as the ideology which inspired them was being crushed out of existence and consigned to oblivion. The age of personal piety. On the political and religious fronts, Akhenaten's attempt to reimpose the Old Kingdom's mythology of royal divinity in all its stringency had effectively put an end to that mythology once and for all. As a result, the whole edifice of royal mediation between gods and men collapsed, to be replaced by a new arrangement in which divine kingship resided not in Pharaoh, but in Amun-Ra, the king of gods and men alike. For all practical purposes, Egypt had now become a theocracy, over which Amun-Ra and the deities subordinate to him ruled directly by means of oracles and other forms of divine intervention. The effects of this theological transformation were ultimately almost as radical as the failed reforms of Akhenaten were intended to be. No longer could the kings of Egypt pretend to be divine figures in their own right. Henceforth they were reduced to mere men, servants of the gods like any other. As for their subjects, they no longer needed the pharaoh's intercessions on their behalf. Instead, they offered petitions directly to the gods through personal prayer, adored the gods through personal hymns of praise, gave thanks to the gods through votive offerings, and in some cases even confessed their sins publicly on penitential stelae. This personal piety, as it has come to be called, was certainly not unique to the post-Amarna age, nor even to the New Kingdom. Indeed, its roots go back to the beginnings of Egyptian civilization. But after Amarna, the attitude of personal piety became the dominant mood of Egyptian religion, and its practices became one of that religion's primary features, even at the highest levels of society. It would remain so with ever greater thoroughness and intensity throughout the Ramesside period and beyond. As Jan Assmann observed, Egyptian religion before the New Kingdom had three dimensions: political, cosmic, and mythical. But personal piety is none of these. Rather, it is the eruption of a fourth dimension in the form of a consciousness of historical process. Historical events are henceforth seen as the direct interventions of the gods in human affairs, and consequently, the old principle of stability and orderly repetition is replaced by one of arbitrary divine will. As a result, the wise man, who by his insight is capable of attuning himself to the principles of social order, is succeeded by the pious man, who attunes and subordinates himself to the will of God. We can capture some of the flavor of this new transformation in Egyptian religion from the private letters of the Ramesside era. These typically opened with an invocation of the writer's personal deity or deities. Every single day I call upon Amun-Ra Harakti when he rises and sets to keep you safe, to give you life, prosperity, and health, a long lifetime, a good ripe old age, and favor in the presence of gods and men. And such letters often contained requests that others pray for the author in return. Don't neglect taking water to Amun of the thrones of the two lands, and call upon him to bring me back from the wilds, the place where I am, for I do not sleep either night or day, being so anxious about you. Moreover, don't neglect taking water to Amun, united with eternity, and inquire of eternity, and inquire of, will you bring him back safe? Clearly this goes beyond rote formulas and social niceties to a heartfelt personal engagement with the powers who hold one's fate in their hands. In the writings of the priests especially, this kind of piety could reach heights of devotion and eloquence strongly reminiscent of the Hebrew Psalms. Erich Hornung aptly described the post-Amarna era as characterized by a humble piety resigned to the unfathomable will of the divine and trusting in its capacity for deliverance. As a result, both king and people submitted themselves more and more completely to the will, action, and percipience of the deity. In the age of personal piety, man surrenders himself entirely into God's hands and scarcely even hopes for solace from human actions. As we shall see, and as Hornung himself correctly observed, it is from this same age of personal piety that the Instruction of Amenemope emerged. It is no surprise, then, to discover that it displays the spirit of that era in almost every line. Horemheb and the Reem asides, first read 211070 BC. With Horeb a new era began, an era of shrinking incomes, increased external pressures, and greater severity in governmental controls. The golden age of endless wealth and unchallenged power had come to an end, and henceforth life in Egypt would, of necessity, be framed more modestly.